Hello, everyone. Give everybody a minute here to get entered in. See some familiar names in the attendee list. Everybody wants to drop a note into the chat and say hello. Do the customary LinkedIn profile, location where you're joining from. First time caller, long time listener, right? We'll get started in 30 seconds or so. Let's see here. And we just want to make sure that on our chat, we've got that set up to be to everyone and not just the host and panelists. I don't know if there's a setting on that. There you go. All right, well, let's get started. We've got some time in front of us. Thank you again, everybody, for joining. Hopefully you're here for the webinar here between Prism and PMO Squad, and we're going to be talking about from delivery to strategy, the modern PMO roadmap. Maybe a slight different spin from what you hear on traditional PMO discussions, but that's okay because there's more than one way to get to the end game of where you're going. For those who don't know, you're looking at us two times now. It's like looking in the mirror inside the mirror inside the mirror. Dan, you want to take a few minutes just to introduce yourself and say hello?
Sure thing. Yeah, Joe, good to see you again. Looking forward to today. Hi, everyone. Dan Marini. I lead the revenue team here at Prism PPM as well as customer success. My background is mostly in project management career-wise. I was a former project manager myself and have spent the last 4 or 5 years really partnering with PMOs of various different stages in terms of their individual maturity or capability spectrum to get them where they ultimately need to be and want to be. And I think at the center of that really consistently is closing that very elusive at times strategy to execution gap. So on our last call, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but our last session, we talked about ways that you can go about diagnosing that. Today, we're going to pivot into more of the design phase of that. And we'll kind of talk about both sides of the coin, right? From a technology standpoint, but also, and equally importantly, from more of a people, process, and infrastructure side. So looking forward to today, Joe. I'll hand things over to you, even though I'm sure most of our folks know you already by name.
Yeah, of course, Joe Puz, PMO Joe, founder and CEO of the PMO Squad, also founder of the PMO Leader Global Community, co-founder of VP MMA, the Veteran Project Manager Mentoring Alliance, a nonprofit to be able to assist veterans and military spouses transitioning into civilian project management careers. And really, it's about service. My whole point of my career at this point of my existence is how can we help organizations and people get to where they want to be? So part of that's going to be today. We're going to talk about PMO leaders and organizations and getting to where they need to be. So thank you all for joining. We do have the chat going. Feel free to chat in there. We have Q&A available to be able to ask questions as well. But fire away. Don't be bashful. This is an interactive session. So topics today, we'll touch briefly on what we talked about. This is a 3-part series. So if number 1 session was on diagnose, this is design, strategy, execution challenges. We'll talk a little bit about total strategy and the 6 disciplines within it. Then our next session, session 3 in September, will be on accelerate. Once we have the diagnose, the design, how do we then accelerate and get us to where we're going? And of course, questions at the end, but don't hold to the end, right? If you've got questions, let's make it interactive and pop them in the chat. Dan, you want to talk a little bit about session 1?
Yes, let's do it. So a couple weeks ago, Joe, you and I talked about sort of diagnosing the gap, right? We talked about ways to identify warning signs that a PMO might be losing its seat at the table, and specifically how to diagnose some of those symptoms through, I think, a few different lenses, right? Data and technology being one of them, people and process being a few others. And again, really the goal was to understand where those gaps exist before deciding on how to fix them. And I think today is really the natural progression of what comes next, right? Once you know where the gaps are, how do you intentionally design an operating model and infrastructure, some behavioral changes in terms of how to mitigate those gaps and ultimately close them? So I think a quick disclaimer I would give, and just something I hear a lot when talking with PMO leaders, is the word design, or in some cases redesign, does not mean in most cases tearing down everything that a PMO already does, and in a lot of cases does well. And I think most of the PMOs that we partner with, regardless of the stage that they're at, they've got more that's worth protecting than replacing, right? There's a lot of PMOs with great project managers. They've got processes that work. They're delivering projects, and most of those projects are on time, under budget, in scope. But the challenge oftentimes that I encounter with PMOs is they can sometimes turn into sort of a passive recipient of the work rather than a strategic decision maker of the work. And even when they're really good at delivering, they can still struggle to answer some bigger questions, namely, why are we doing this? And how do we know that the work that we're actually doing is producing the outcomes that we expected? So I think those two questions, and some of the pieces we'll talk about today are really critical in terms of shifting from a project delivery organization to a strategic service operation. And Joe, maybe that's a good place for us to start, and I'll hand things back to you. When you think about designing that strategic service model, like what often needs to change from a design standpoint, early on in your engagements?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the recap on first session leading into today. And really, we're going to talk about this, but we're going to get into the detail, and we're going to get interactive feedback from all of you in a second. But as we think about design of a PMO or an organization, I want it to be about project delivery as opposed to project management, right? And we're all in the project management industry, but we don't want to manage this stuff. We want to deliver this stuff, and we want to build an organization that delivers. So if we're delivering, if we're that function, if we're, the accounting department, the sales department, the engineering department, the legal department, and the project delivery department, if we're delivering for the organization, everything we're delivering is for the organization, right? It's their work that we're delivering. We're leading that effort for them. And to do that, we want to have a service mindset. How are we built and structured and organized to deliver services outward to our internal customers, or maybe even external customers as well? So that's from a design perspective. But where we find the flaw and the gap in all of this is strategy developed by the organization. Our then project delivery function is then charged to go deliver it. And then we have this gap. We're seeing this gap in this. So what I want is feedback from all of you. Use the QR code if you got your phones out, and I know you do because you're humans. So go out there and join Menti, put in that code, and this is a word cloud. So type in there, what is your number one challenge with strategy execution in your organization? We have opinions because we work with clients around the world, and it tells us all the time what we're seeing. But here's your chance, right? I want to get this over 50 plus responses in here in the system. So we're going to take a little bit of time to allow all of you to get your feedback in and see what the real-time research shows us with this little proof of concept we're working with right now. We got 21 people logged in. Everybody else, take your time and get in there. Let's get your feedback, right? We want to get your information as well. Resources, interesting. Resources and alignment, winning the race. We have well over 50 people in the conference, in this session right now. So let's get more opinions in here.
I see a lot of priorities Joe, prioritization, changing, competing priorities. I know we've got some stuff queued up to talk about specifically to that later, so I'm excited.
Yeah, keep it coming. Lola put behavior change in the chat. Did you put behavior change in the Menti as well, Lola? Let's get your feedback over there. Let's get you included with everyone else. And yes, let's have everybody connect with Lola out on LinkedIn and everybody else. Too many priorities. We've got somebody sneaking in trying to get up to speed as well. These three seem to be standing out with the most feedback in there. So let's think about this, right? And this, let's keep this interactive because I'm going to ask some questions and in chat type your responses in there. Resources. What do you mean by resources? If you typed resources in, does that mean not enough resources? Were you thinking maybe not the right resources? Um, Here we go. Keith, not enough people. Okay. People agree with Keith. Is that what you meant if you put resources in there? What else were you thinking from a resource perspective? Because there's two ways to look at that. If we say not enough people, does it really mean maybe there's too much work? And if there's too much work, maybe that ties into too many priorities, or the one right above it. So to me, I think, but I want you all to provide your context. I think too many priorities and resources may be two sides of the same coin. Strategies not prioritized with right resources. Yeah, those two are connected, right? Resources working on too many projects at once, which could be a prioritization problem. Soon there'll be more robots than I have. There won't be a problem anymore, right? Tony, no one's going to be working. We're just going to be doing webinars all day, talking about what our robots are doing for us. Yeah, I mean, that's great feedback, right? Um, let's add in here now alignment. If you put alignment in here, what does this mean? Is alignment meaning um, the strategy doesn't align to the work in the portfolio? Or we don't have the right skill, or the budget's not being allocated to the strategic items? What does alignment mean here for you? Yeah, Mawson's comment, if intake is not properly governed, you can't manage resources. Well, this is strategic alignment. So why is there intake that's impacting strategy? Strategy should be automatically in, right? Um, but let's see what everybody says, right? Priorities, too many priorities. Alignment. Here we go. Alignment from Dawn. Alignment across the organization so we're all working on the right things. Okay. Robert's misalignment through the lens of prisoner's dilemma. The first session a few weeks ago touched on this controversial topic. Yeah. Okay. This is good feedback. It's great feedback, right? Because it's real. It's something that all of you are experiencing out there, and you have the input to be able to provide that. So thank you for sharing both in the chat and in the word cloud what you're running into with this. So strategy execution gap. Let's talk about this, right? Because we want to get aligned on what the definition is, and we're thinking the same thing so we can have a consistent conversation the rest of the way. And don't let this at any point turn into a lecture of Dan and I talking to you. We want the dialogue to continue in the chat as well, right? So strategy execution gap is not an execution failure. Execution has its own failures. Don't get me wrong. We have opportunities where projects don't finish the way they want to. But strategy execution gap is the space between strategy and execution. There's issues and challenges with strategy. There's issues and challenge with execution. But then that alignment discussion we just heard you people had, you attendees had put in here, this is where this is. This is living in that strategy execution gap. It's the structural failure between strategy and execution where that gap exists. And we want to focus on that as we continue to talk through this. So if we think strategy, execution, gap in between, goes both directions, what does it look like? Well, PMO Squad, we did a bunch of research on this, and we actually have research ongoing right now. If you haven't yet participated in our global survey on strategy execution, it's available today, and I think Michelle will put a link out there. There's no cost, of course, to participate in this. There's no personally identifying information. It's global in nature, so no matter where you're located, feel free to participate. There's 20 questions, and it takes less than 10 minutes. So we've done some internal research, but now we're researching with the world. We want to be able to collect that data. And what we found is that there are three dimensions. It's a 3D gap. When we think about the gap, so much time and energy and investment has been made in a horizontal gap, right? Our departments don't work together well. Accounting doesn't give us the budget that we need for IT, and IT doesn't connect with the marketing department, and we have misalignment, and everybody thinks that misalignment is horizontal. But what we've found when we've done this additional research, there are two other dimensions to the gap. One of them is fairly widely known as well. That's the vertical, right? Executives think we're doing one thing, but as we go from executive to director to manager to worker, there's four altitudes within an organization, and they get misaligned. And because of that misalignment, a manager in a department puts in a request to work on a project that doesn't line up with the strategy set by the executives, and now we have a gap between vertical alignment. But the third one is one that is rarely ever mentioned and rarely ever talked about, and all three of them happening at the same time is never talked about and never mentioned. Temporal is time. And think about this. All of our organizations are operating, right? We make and produce widgets, and we have SLAs to our existing operations of the organization. So in IT, for instance, if there's an outage, work stops and we have an SLA to put that and repair that outage. Well, the workers who are repairing that outage, if they were working on a project, time just lost for the project and operations won. So we have resources who are being pulled to work emergencies, fire drills, changing priorities, etc. And time is our worst enemy in that case. So we have three breaks within an organization where strategy execution can fail. Horizontal, vertical, temporal, and they don't happen independently. They're all happening collectively. So Dan, with your customers, when you're working with them, do you hear about these three things, and what's kind of the feedback and reaction to that when you guys experience that?
Well, definitely, Joe. And when we started this partnership, this is something that I think that your thesis on this was something that really stood out to me, because I think the takeaway that I get in working with PMOs, and I'm sure obviously you've kind of deduced the same, is there's a lot of different places the chain can break. As you said, it can break horizontally across functions, it can break vertically, it can break over time. And then kind of underneath and throughout that, you've got really the people and the systems in place that determine whether or not the organization can actually respond. I think a good example of this, I was speaking with a PMO leader actually between our previous conversation and today. And by most traditional measures, the PMO is doing a really good job, right? The projects were getting delivered mostly on time, mostly under budget, mostly within scope. But they had a new CIO come aboard and was asking questions that they just really weren't used to and maybe not properly equipped to answer. Questions like, why are we doing this in the first place? Which kind of comes back to priorities, competing priorities, changing priorities that a lot of our attendees entered. And questions like, what are we getting back from these investments? And that's kind of where that PMO's leader's answers got a little bit fuzzy. So I think that's a good example of, a PMO that is not bad at execution or delivery, just haven't really fully executed that to strategy yet. And there's a few examples there, if you were to dig deeper, where you could see specifically where maybe the chain was breaking horizontally, vertically, and also over time.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the people and systems within organizations. So I put this next layer within the strategy execution gap. And systems here does not mean technology solutions, right? Systems in this case are the systems within an organization, system dynamics and building out business systems of how does authority happen? How does approvals happen? How does prioritization happen? How do those systems of a business, how does it function? How does it work? And whatever those systems are, they create the conditions that the organization operates within. But the organization isn't people, right? It's a collection of people. So then the people have to work within those conditions to create the outcomes. So systems, the business systems create the conditions. People then work within those systems to create outcomes. And this is where we see a lot of the hero syndrome, right? Where a flawed system can have a hero come in and create a great result. But if you have multiple flawed systems, you need multiple heroes, right? So you have these gaps that keep coming. So three dimensions of the gap that are created, enhanced, fixed, repaired, work, all connected together by the foundations that every organization operates within. And Robert puts in there systems, habits, routines, muscle memory. Absolutely. The challenge with that is if it's a bad system, it's muscle memory of a bad system, right? So we have to try to overcome those things. And as PMO leaders within our organizations, a lot of our muscle memory is built around not serving the organization, but serving the PMO. How do we ensure we're creating the dashboard we need, as opposed to asking, is that dashboard providing value to the leaders of the organization? So absolutely, totally agree with what you have, Robert. Now, if we drill into systems and people, we start looking what are the disciplines within the organization that actually make up those three areas. So within systems, we have architecture of creating total strategy. Total strategy, the definition of that is strategy to execution. That whole round trip world that you live in is total strategy. Create the strategy to execute the strategy creates total strategy. Where there's gaps in between is that's where organizations live today, and we're trying to get them out of those gaps to get them into a point of total strategy, right? The strategic focus of the organization. And we're going to talk in more detail about each of these six as we keep moving forward. The intelligence, right? The AI that Tony had mentioned in there, right? What are we learning from all of this? Robert mentions that systems, habits, routines, muscle memory, those are all learnings. And that intelligence that we capture from the ability to deliver on strategy and to create a total strategy environment should be a self-fulfilling, self-learning system that's going in to be able to help it. Same with the people side of this. If we think about organizational safety, I don't know how many PMO leaders who have told me that when they're in front of a steering committee or an executive committee and they're reporting project status out or reporting their dashboard out, they get nervous, they get stressed, they have panic attacks about reporting red, right? Red is beautiful. It shouldn't be avoided. If there's a problem, you're talking to the people that can help you overcome it. But organizational safety, they're afraid that they don't have the empowerment or candor to be able to talk honestly and truthfully about the progress, about a department that may not be delivering the way they need to, or whether maybe there's teammates that are being pulled in multiple directions. You have to have safety inside an organization to truly be effective and deliver total strategy. Execution excellence, we talked about the resources, getting the right people on the right things with the right skills to be able to deliver the right outcomes. Well, those people have to have the right training, the right systems, right tools, the technology, all of those things to be able to do that. And then finally, does the organization actually identify as a strategic organization? Or are they truly an ops organization? And identity is so important and rarely talked about within the project management space. I'm a big believer in Atomic Habits. I love that book. and this comes out of that. So all six of these foundations or disciplines rather tied into those two foundations are all through historical research and perspective of delivery and organizational dynamics and how organizations build, how they're successful. Um, and a lot of that goes into what we're looking at here. And the next layer down is going to be capabilities. But before we get into that, if you're new to total strategy and seeing these three layers here and you have questions, I just want to pause for a moment to give people a chance to be able to ask some questions about these three different layers, and see if there's anything we can address for you at that point. And Dan, certainly if you've got any feedback, I know you've got plenty to say when we get into the next slide, but anything over here, welcome to do that as well.
Yeah, I think I definitely want to dive deeper on those, especially those three disciplines to the left, and knowing obviously technology is one of the systems I think that can create conditions. And one of the things we talked about with diagnosing a couple weeks ago, Joe, was and I think it was Robert who brought this up earlier: systems, habits, routines, muscle memories. I think that's something that technology can also help enforce and encourage. Right, the best condition, you can see it here on the screen. Systems can create conditions. The best condition I think technology can create is making the right behavior the easiest behavior, which is something that we talked about a few weeks ago. Probably circle back at some point today. Strategic focus is, we saw a lot of prioritization in our slide when we asked the audience a couple minutes ago. So I think that's really at the center of sort of closing this gap. So I'm excited to talk about that a little bit more. And I really like what you said about dashboards and reporting, right? I think a lot of PMOs, and this comes from different places. It's not only a technology issue, but there can be a tendency to report at times maybe defensively, and also maybe to report for the sake of reporting, just because of maybe some of the tools that they have access to or don't have access to. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that as well in a few minutes.
Yeah. And I want to go into a comment here Heidi had put in here about the practicing, right, piano. A question out to the community, and maybe even a challenge to all of you PMO leaders and project managers on the call here, is how much practicing are you doing with your project management and your PMO? Right? When we think about intelligence and safety, practice is part of that. How much role playing are you doing within your PMOs before there's a steering committee meeting? How much practice are you doing when it comes to working on your tools and using your systems? How much safety do you feel to be able to say, I don't know how to use this tool. Can I get some training beyond what I currently have? Oftentimes we look down on this and we say, you're a professional. You've been doing this for 20 years. You should know how to do it. I don't have time to teach you how to do something you should know how to do. Listen, I've been at this a long time. I got gray hair and no hair on top. I still practice every day. I still need to learn every day. And are we creating those conditions for our team members to be safe, to be able to practice within their organizations? So stuff to be able to consider, right? So thanks for the feedback. Appreciate that in the chat. So let's dig into the capabilities, right? This is a lot on screen right now to be able to absorb. So it's going to be up here for a while. So take some time to look at it. We're going to talk through these disciplines. So the 6 disciplines across the top were the 6 disciplines that were listed on the prior screen. So think we've got strategy execution gap at the top. That gap in the center is caused by horizontal, vertical, and temporal dimensions. We then utilize and want to look at the systems and people inside of our organization to figure out how we can fix them. And we do it within the 6 dimensions that are listed here. And here's a big change that I think most PMO leaders fail on. And we intentionally changed this at the PMO squad when we built Total Strategy. We're not building towards maturity. We're building towards capability. And we're not building towards PMO capability. We're building towards organizational capability. PMOs don't deliver in a vacuum. As a service provider to your organization, the entire organization has to be capable. right? So we want to look at the capabilities within the disciplines that span across the organization. And certainly PMO maturity is good and we welcome it and we want it, but that's not the ceiling. That's not our end game. Our end game is to reach capability to deliver strategy, right? And a mature PMO fails to deliver strategy a lot. A capable organization delivers on strategy regularly, right? So build and mature your PMO. And then the next step beyond that is how do we take the organization to be capable? I'll give you additional information on this and then we'll dig into the detail on some of this. When we built Total Strategy, we went out and built modeling to be able to understand how would this perform and how would it work within an organization. And we simulated over 10,000 organizations. And we utilized two of the most widely known and accepted PMO building processes and methodologies in the world, and we entered them into the simulation. And we entered the total strategy into the simulation as well. In PMOs, both PMO models were great at building PMO maturity, but only reached 1%, I think it was 1.4, 1.5% completion of strategy delivery. They didn't close the gap because a mature PMO doesn't do it. But an organization focusing on capabilities such as total strategy that we have in front of us here, those organizations were hitting 67, 68%, eliminating the strategy execution gap. So the factor was mind-blowing when we went in and simulated this. Building a PMO is great if you're going to just turtle up and stay inside the PMO shell. If you want to be able to branch beyond the PMO and deliver strategy for your organization as a true service provider to do that, you have to get into the organization as well and start building that capability. So Dan, let's dig into some of those capabilities. You want to talk through some of these?
Yeah. I'll start, I think, on the far left here, with total strategy architecture. And I think what stands out to me when I look at this is consistency. If we're going to be intentional about how we structure the work, there needs to be some common understanding within the PMO and the wider organization of how work actually moves through the organization. And that's where I think centralization becomes really important. I think centralization, specifically through a technology lens, is a little bit too often implying let's just throw everything into one tool for the sake of it, right? And that is not the kind of the methodology that we take, at least, right? SharePoint's a great document management solution. Jira is a great tool for devs, but for the PMO specifically, we want to make sure that the work going through the PMO is as centralized as possible. And if there is, information from other solutions that is impacting that work, then there is sort of the ability to kind of speak back and forth. Joe, do you mind if I take the wheel really quick here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Screen share. Give me one sec. I'm in Prism now. I think one of the ways that we sort of bring this to life is this life cycle stage workflow screen that I'm in now. Most of the PMOs that I speak to have already defined the life cycle of how work moves, right? From intake through prioritization and all the way through project closeout. And within each one of these stages of the PMOs that we work with, we're not just changing the label, right? We can define different workflows, approvals, requirements, and sort of governance that needs to happen before work moves forward. And the result of this is, again, from a centralization standpoint, is the process isn't living in somebody's head. It's not scattered across 4 or 5 different tools. It's not in a diagram that nobody's opened in 3 or 4 months. And a lot of times when I sit down with PMOs on our first conversation, we actually map their life cycle. We'll find that there's a different tool almost every step of the way, or a different technology, right? Requests come in through a form or an email. Prioritization, if it's done at all, will happen in sort of a spreadsheet. Project plan might live somewhere else for the execution. Resources are managed somewhere else. Everything is thrown into a PowerPoint at some point to kind of stitch this all together for leadership. And that creates really problems in both directions, right? Upstream, it's harder to make good decisions because you don't necessarily have a complete picture of demand, of capacity, of what's in flight. And then downstream, you've got folks that are toggling between two, three, four different solutions day to day. They're duplicating efforts. They're trying to figure out where the actual source of truth lives rather than doing the work that they actually like to do, which will ultimately contribute to strategy. So, Joe, maybe a question for you. When you're designing sort of an operating model with a PMO, how much does technology fragmentation itself become a barrier in your experience, where it's not necessarily a bad process, but it's a good process that just is not connected to itself?
Yeah, I'd say fairly rarely, right? We see if oftentimes a PMO will be running a tool like Prism, and then the marketing department will be in a different tool. Engineering will be in a different tool. Executives may be using a different tool. And there's no single source of truth, right? So when they talk about a common strategy, they then go into a different system to try to help go execute on the strategy. And now you've immediately taken the common strategy and forked it, right? You've created it to go in multiple directions. And then the people get confused. Which system do I go make my updates in? How do I log my time? How do I find the current status? So absolutely, I'd say almost every organization we go into, the PMO has a challenge with across the organization because there's multiple different tools being used.
Well, I think you just called out too something that's really important of the idea of the single source of truth, right? We think about this a lot when we think about the PMO or different departments, in terms of how they're using technology. But the other side of sort of a single source of truth is just for the individual, right? And we talked a little bit about this on our last session, so I won't spend a ton of time here. But the PMO, right, has designed this beautiful operating model, but ultimately people have to operate in it, right? And the individual, I don't necessarily need to understand the entire architecture. I want to know on my day to day, what do I need to do? What projects am I currently managing? What's coming up? What risks require my attention? And I think, as you called out in our last slide, Joe, like a PMO can only operate as strategically as its people allows it to. And again, I believe as Robert had called out, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the idea that systems and technology being one of those systems can create sort of the right muscle memory and the right behavioral muscle memory to sort of start to close that gap. So we'll kind of come back to this in a second. Joe, I'll give you the screen back here because I did want to pivot into strategic focus, because I think that was something that came up quite a bit when we heard from the audience, which we saw again a lot of prioritization. I think I saw Tony call out a phenomenon that I talked about last week a little bit, which is kind of the idea of squeaky wheel prioritization that a lot of PMOs can struggle with, where it's never going to be, prioritizing work at the top of the funnel is never going to be a completely empirical process. But it also can't be just fully kind of based on judgment calls. And I thought that was a good call out from earlier. And we had somebody else call out in terms of resourcing, like there's not enough folks to do the actual work. And Joe, you aptly pointed out, well, is that a resourcing constraint or is it a problem with demand? So I'm curious, Joe, before I maybe talk a little bit about the technology portion of this, what do you see more, considering those were two of our biggest bubbles there, prioritization and resources, and I think that they directly impact each other. What do you usually see more of when you start working with a PMO? Is it truly there is not enough folks to do the job and they need to aggressively expand and hire, or is it the top of the funnel and sort of the demand process is maybe broken at times?
Yeah, great question. And just going back to the question I put in the chat first before I answer that one about the technologies, we have one PM technology. I'll challenge everybody. I guarantee you don't, because when we survey this, the number one PM technology solution used around the world every year we've ever surveyed has been Microsoft Excel. So if you have Prism today and you're using Excel, then you have two systems. And I would challenge people out there to be able to say that, right? How do you consider Excel in comparison to a Prism? But coming back to your question, I think I think the challenge with that one isn't an either or, right? Part of total strategy is actually built on both and thinking. And oftentimes when we're looking for solutions, we'll ask that same question. Is this a prioritization problem or is it a resource problem? And as PMO leaders, what we run into is it's an and discussion. And we don't know how to have those discussions consistently, or we don't feel comfortably having those discussions with our executives to let them know that it's an and discussion. We don't have enough resources. Sounds like we're a victim and we need help. You have created too many priorities for us. Sounds like a finger pointing exercise. And the reality is they're both happening at once. And when we can change the dynamic of that discussion to be able to say, let me share with you some data that's going to demonstrate to you that there's a lot of work happening and we've got some amazing people doing it. And we have this gap today that we can't do all of it because both things are existing at the same time. So how do we change the conversation to be a both discussion as opposed to an either or would be how I'd really answer that one.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was the same PMO I mentioned earlier. I was speaking with them, and they mentioned that right now they've got around 40 active initiatives. So I asked them, how many of those would the business or you consider high priority? And the answer was, they were kind of laughing as they said it, but all of them, right? And I think at that point, priority doesn't really mean anything anymore, right? If everything is priority number one, you've effectively decided not to prioritize. And I think that comes back to Joe, to your point around sometimes you've got to have difficult conversations, right? We have finite amount of resources and budget and the ability to throw both at only a finite amount of projects. There's always going to be more demand than there is, available capacity and resources. So we've got to make hard decisions. And the way that we think about prioritizing, and I can take the screen back real quick, Joe, if you don't mind, is sort of giving the PMO at least like the teeth to have those conversations. So I think quickly from an intake standpoint, gathering both the what and the why at the creating consistency at the front door. I'm going to give a really terrible example of a quick intake just for the sake of time here, but from a prioritization lens, yeah, mentioned sort of that squeaky wheel piece that I encounter a lot, but most PMOs don't want that to go away, and I don't think it should, right? Like judgments should be made by people talking in a room. It should not be just made based on a number that a scoring criteria made. But I think when we talk about becoming a more strategic service model, that is an important distinction, right? We can't treat every piece of demand as though it's equally valuable, equally urgent, equally aligned to strategy. And the role of like a process like this, where organization based on its strategic initiatives and pillars, and can come in and get a really relevant score, prioritization score at the top of the funnel. You can at least have those conversations with some empirical data to back that up. When I think about the PMO that I talked to earlier about fielding questions from their CIO of why are we doing this, they want to be able to say both early on in the at the very top of the funnel and also just later downstream, here's why we're doing this, and then ultimately here's how it's performing versus the outcomes that we expected. So yeah, I guess, Joe, maybe another question for you then is how often do you see that where PMOs have a prioritization process in place, but maybe to your point, don't have the organizational safety to properly enforce it the way that I'm sure they'd like to?
Yeah, I think it's regular where this goes to maturity and versus capability. PMO has built a very mature prioritization process. Everybody in the organization is aware of it because it has maturity. And they're going to come in and they prioritize. Oftentimes there's multiple number ones, like you said, and it's 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E. And it's like, no, there's only one, right? But that then falls apart when we look at org capability. Because if the executive governing committee sets prioritization and then a rogue manager or rogue director or rogue executive or rogue individual then chooses to approve work that didn't come through that prioritization, you don't have compliance, right? You don't have capability. The org may have low capability, even though the PMO had created high maturity. So happens all the time. I've yet to find an organization that would be completely satisfied with where they're at with that. But the better organizations, the highly capable organizations, have found a way to be able to take the maturity of the PMO and get that to work across the organization, right? Prioritization may be done quarterly, but they have an on ramp to be able to get emergencies in and to be able to work stuff through. So, uh, yeah, very frequent, all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah, I think, and we think about those swim lanes too. Like to this point, at least my focus has kind of been structuring the work and then selecting the work that we want to do. And Joe, you had brought this up earlier, where the natural progression next is sort of assessing how we are doing on the work, either throughout its life cycle or towards the end. I know we're coming up on Q&A, so I'll be pretty quick here. But a big piece that we heard earlier too was resourcing, and I think assessing the, hey, why should we do the work? Okay, here's why. Can we do the work is sort of the next natural question here. And having the ability, again, with through centralization, having everything in one place. If I'm an executive, my focus is not, hey, what is Joe doing for 8 hours on Thursday? I want to understand, are our project managers doing really across the organization, at a relatively high level. So when I'm sitting in those steering committees or those quarterly reprioritization meetings, I can understand, okay, yes, we should be looking to take on this work, but importantly, do we actually have the bandwidth to go ahead and do that? Which, again, I can't remember the attendee who had called that out. The directly sort of proportionate there, right, or inversely proportionate, depending on the way that you might look at it. So once we've answered those two strategic questions of, hey, is the work worth doing, and can we actually support it? Once it's underway, I think the natural pivot then is, how are we performing on it? And this is where I think the capability you have it as, Joe, is sort of that strategic delivery visibility starts to come into play, and technology is something that I think can really help bolster that. Prism's dashboards, I think, being a good example here, where as an executive, I really want to, I don't want to just have reporting for the sake of reporting. I want to quickly understand where things are, where they're healthy, where they're not healthy. Hey, if red is there, that just means let's go figure out the red and kind of triage it as a team. But I can start sort of at these higher level dashboards and looking at, rather than individual project plans, I can look across programs and strategic initiatives to understand, okay, what needs my attention as a leader. Subsequently sort of drill into the underlying projects that make up a program, and then take it even a level deeper from the project level into an individual scorecard, so I can go in and speak to my stakeholders on our steering committees or whatever sort of the organizational setting might be for this. So I think that's an important, again, just to kind of tie this back to both strategic delivery, visibility, design as a whole, and then dashboarding, as you had called it out, Joe. We want to report in order to act, right, in order to make decisions and to empower our executives to make decisions. And I think an important part of doing that culturally is reporting from a place of not defensiveness, but just a place where we can feel comfortable informing. And there is a cultural element to that as well, of course, that technology alone can't solve. But I know we're coming up on the 10-minute mark, and we wanted to break for questions. Joe, anything you'd add just before I maybe give the screen back to you here?
No, I think the key, and a lot of people have always asked me, why do we PMO Squad host these webinars with technology partners, right? Why do you do that? And my answer is because it's reality. This is like the PMO doesn't exist without their tool. And whether or not you're a Prism user or not, and if you're not, certainly recommend you check them out to be able to see the capability. Just seeing the system and understanding that there's a way to be able to have our processes managed and worked through the system is important. So I think it's not something we should ever run away from. It's something we should run towards. As PMO leaders, how can I consistently interact with service providers, whether they're PMO firms like ours or whether technology firms like Prism, to be able to understand what are the capabilities in those systems and how can they make my company more capable, right? I think Tim won the award for most systems he listed in the chat. But he called out a bunch of them that others may not have thought about, right? It's the BI system, it's the Jira system, it's the Prism system, it's the PowerPoint, it's the Excel, all of those. The more knowledge we have about those technologies, the better it's going to make us at our job, because we can then make choices that are going to be smart ones to be able to help the organization. Right. So that's my point from this, right? Is that we should be running to these types of discussions and seeking out partners that we can work with to be able to talk to. So as a PMO leader, same thing, right? Make sure you've got the right tools to help your organization be successful. And before we move into Q&A specifically, we've got a question in there, I think, for you, Dan, from Paul. Is this project scorecard directly fed from the project plan itself in Prism?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it is. And I think, again, that kind of goes back to centralization. And one of the big bubbles we saw, at least from a technology lens, alignment, right? Having every, as much as we can that makes sense to under one roof, sort of alleviates different pain points. And I think all three of the areas that you had mentioned, Joe, earlier, horizontally, vertically, and over time, I think reporting being a really good example of that, right? The place that I'm executing and managing my project as a PM, those status reports that I'm working on, those risks that I'm entering and mitigating are automatically rolling up to these dashboards for my executives to view, consume, and ultimately action. So absolutely, Paul. Appreciate the question.
Yeah. And, we kind of talked on the left side of this, and we're not going to dig in right on the right side of this. So more information, of course, about this. Also, if you want to know how your organization stacks up with total strategy, we have an online assessment. Take you less than 5 minutes probably, out on the PMO Squad website. Go out and take that assessment. It'll give you, again, it's not a lot of questions. We have a full 58 question panel if you want to get the full assessment done. But it gives you directionally, where is my organization today? Are we in the gap? Have we reached kind of nirvana and we're outside the gap? We've been able to close it. Strongly encourage everybody to go out there and take that real quick assessment just to see where you're at. So Q&A, we've been kind of trying to hit these as we've been going in flight here throughout the session as well. But you've seen a lot, right, about total strategy and how a PMO should be thinking capabilities versus maturity, how to be able to set up as a service organization to serve our internal and external customers, the tools that we would utilize to be able to do that effectively within an organization, and the capabilities that Prism can provide to you and your team. What comes to mind? What can we answer for you about any of that, or maybe stuff we didn't hit on that you would want to? But I think we hit on alignment. I think we hit on prioritization, and I think we hit on resources, which out of our word cloud were the three top items that popped up with challenges with strategy execution.
Joe, I see a question from Robert here. Joe and Dan, inside Prism or not, anything come to mind that you had to unlearn? What methodology baggage have you purged?
That's a great question. I think for me, what I had to unlearn was the maturity element being the number one thing I was focused on. My project management training and practice growing up through the organizations was all built on maturity. And a real world story I can share with this. My last job I had as an executive director of the PMO at Wellstar Health System in Atlanta, we were running a project to extend Wi-Fi through one of our hospitals. And to be able to put those Wi-Fi extenders where it was located, one had to go in the ceiling of a surgery room. And we had a very mature process of how this was going to take place. And the vendor came in, put the Wi-Fi extender up into the ceiling of the surgery room, and the next morning was an open heart surgery scheduled. They didn't clean the room after they installed the Wi-Fi extender. So the mature process that we had mapped out and had executed like on the 20 other Wi-Fi extenders that we had built into the hospital system, that mature process, it failed on capability. And because of that, that open heart surgery had to get rescheduled. My boss at the time shared with me how displeased he was in our ability to not deliver the way that we needed to. And I couldn't say to him, "Oh, but man, we have a really mature process that we followed." It didn't matter. That moment in time was the light switch moment for me where I recognized that maturity is great up until the point it's not. And at that point is when capability takes over. So I had to unlearn maturity being the end state and recognize that capability was really the end state I needed. How about you?
Great answer, Joe. I don't think mine's quite as good, but I would say my background being in technology before getting into project management, I think the big sort of epiphany for me was that technology alone is not always the answer, right? And I think that's been really a focal point of both of our discussions in the past month is technology is one of the systems that can be in many cases very helpful to creating the right conditions. But and just through a software lens, right? This is things like change management, it's user adoption, it's training, it's comfortability within the platform, and it's platform intuitiveness. But there's a lot of, especially within a PMO, technology alone is not always the solution. For many organizations, it is, right? If they've gone about things the right way as they've kind of built it up. But that was something that I had to unlearn, I would say, a couple of years back. And I think it's also something that we'll talk a little bit more about on our next session, which might make sense to tee up a little bit now. And Paul, I see a question from you that I think is also very relevant to our next session, which is going to be accelerate. And I think at the core of acceleration will be leveraging AI. We'll talk about AI in different ways. I'll specifically talk about it within the Prism platform and how it can be used to, Paul, as you said, forecast risks. It can be used to do some scenario planning, some prioritization, essentially just as an extension of an appropriate stakeholder within the PMO, whether that's a project manager or an executive, where AI can help sort of close this gap. So that would be my answer to the methodology question. And Paul, thank you for your patience. Happy to shoot you over some collateral too. So feel free to take a look on your own time as well.
And Paul does not work for us, but he has been a great straight man in the chat, like leading he's like been right in line with us on all of these items, right? So thanks for that, Paul. One item I'll give a teaser, a freebie before we get to this in the PMO squad mindset with AI. How many of you out there have lessons learned folders that are sitting out in your SharePoints and Confluences and wherever you've got your stuff stored, and they go to die? You never revisit those. A great way to be able to incorporate AI into your PMO is farm the information and knowledge that's in those lessons learned sessions and be able to pull them back to and make them useful once again, right? You've got so much data that's available to you. And perhaps the PMs and PMO leaders aren't even with the organization anymore, but they captured all of that historical context that's not being utilized. So there's an AI tidbit to be able to go out there, be able to, that's right, be able to build your agents on the lessons learned, to be able to go capture that stuff because it's a gold mine of information that's not being utilized. So that's session 3 we've got coming up. When? Oh, there it is. It's in September 15th. We encourage all of you to join us. That's the last of this 3-part series. We've certainly enjoyed sessions 1 and 2. Any last questions from anyone before we sign off for today? Thank you, Anne, for that, and Robert as well. And everybody's interaction, whether it have been in the chat or within the word cloud, appreciate it. Joan, great to see you on here as well. Always great to connect with you and stay current with everything. Keith, appreciate that as well. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time today. Look forward to talking to you in September. And if you have questions for either Dan or I offline, right, please connect with us on LinkedIn as well. Happy to be able to reach out and help however we can. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.